Whenever you do something like this, the minute it's finished, you remember all the stories you should have told. And there was one I should have told, and I'm going to tell now. A perfect example of moral licensing from my mother's life. My mother is Jamaican, and she and my father moved to England in the late 60s. My mother's, at a time when many West Indians were moving to England. And my mother's neighbor, our neighbor when we were in England, who my mother knew quite well, would always talk to my mother about how outrageous it was that so many West Indians were moving to London, despite the fact that my mother was a West Indian who had just moved to London, climaxing with a conversation that this neighbor had with my mother, saying that she and her husband were going to move to South Africa because they were anxious to go to a country that really had their race problems sorted out. Now, what is the psychological explanation for why somebody would say that to my mother? The answer is moral licensing. That the neighbor felt that they were, in a certain sense, insured against the charge of prejudice because they had a black friend, right? Because I'm friends with a black person, I can then say whatever I want about black people, because who can say that I'm biased? I'm not biased. Quite literally, one of my best friends, Joyce Gladwell, is black, right? So it's like, this is a phenomenon that Ephraim would argue is incredibly common and repeated over and over again in all kinds of scenarios where we succeed in doing something socially difficult.
I mean, you mentioned Obama. I've been wrestling with this question of how could a country that 8 years ago elected the first African-American president and reelected him now be even flirting with the possibility of electing someone who'd be the most racist president we've elected in our lifetimes. I don't think it's funny, but that's moral licensing. So
that is classic moral licensing.
But do you think there are individuals who voted for Obama who are going to vote for Trump and who feel that they've sort of exonerated themselves from the imputation that voting for Trump might be racist because they either think to themselves or say to other people, hey, look, I'm not racist, I voted for Obama, but it didn't work out well?
I think that is absolutely what's going on, either publicly or unconsciously. People are saying, yeah, you don't call me a racist. Look who I voted for 8 years ago. But now times have changed. What this country needs is, I don't know exactly what you would describe as the country needing that would result in, anyway. And I think, and that's actually, I think, precisely what Daniel Ephraim would say.
Is moral licensing just about public behavior and this particular kind of public hypocrisy, or is this something that we all do in daily life? You can have a slice of cake because you were on a diet, or you gave some money to charity so you can then do something very wasteful and indulgent. Is that moral licensing too?
There've now been dozens of experiments on the personal realm as well, and that's exactly what they find. That dieting is a classic example. I remember reading recently that the main reason why working out does not tend to reduce weight is that people respond to a trip to the gym by eating far more than they would normally eat. That is moral licensing. You feel so virtuous for having, strolled on the treadmill for 45 minutes that you have 2 hamburgers at dinner, right? So. And then also, I think moral licensing is a huge factor in anti-Semitism. That when you see I think we're going through a resurgence of anti-Semitism. I think many people think, and I agree, in the West right now, and I think it's a form of moral licensing. That people say, look, I've been so down with Jews for so long that I can finally speak up and say, blah, blah, blah. What's
the equivalent? Is there a triggering event? I mean, what's the equivalent there of voting for Barack Obama? Is it that?
Don't know. When you look at the kind of language that people are using about Jews in Europe right now, I think people feel free to express certain sentiments that they would ordinarily be ashamed to say, because they think, look, we've had 40 years or 50 years of being nice to Jews in Europe, so we bought ourselves a little freedom here. In the show, I talk a lot about the history of anti-Semitism in 18th and 19th century Germany. And what's so fascinating is there's a brilliant book by Amos Alon on the history of the Jews in Germany, and in which he talks about this fact that the German anti-Semitism was not a prohibition against all Jews. On the contrary, there were always Jews in Germany in the 18th and 19th century who were beloved. But it was the fact that there were a small number who were beloved that made the general horrendous discrimination against most Jews possible, right? They loved Moses Mendelssohn. Their favorite author was Bertolt Auerbach, right? Richard Wagner would go on about what a fantastic, his favorite writer was Bertolt Auerbach. Richard Wagner hated Jews, right? But he was fine with this one Jewish.
I have a Jewish friend.
Yeah. It's exact. I have a Jewish friend.
There's certain characters whose careers seem almost predicated on being the beneficiary or the token of this kind of moral licensing. I mean, I don't know, Sammy Davis Jr. You know, they always had him. I mean, Nixon would have him to the White House. And, you know, he was his emblem of the Rat Pack. And he proved to everybody that they weren't racist because they had a black friend who performed this part quite wittingly of the black friend. But that must produce tremendous bitterness when you know that that you're there to permit people, that you're there in this sense.
And not only that, because the expectation of the first person who's let in, is that they're going to be a pioneer, right? So you let the first, you're Sammy Davis Jr. and you're visiting the White House, and you think, great, this means that lots of black people are going to visit the White House. And then you wake up one morning and you realize, actually, no one else has. I was just a token, not a pioneer. And that's a moment, an extraordinarily disillusioning moment. I think that's happened to countless women, over the course of centuries, that they've thought they were going to be this great pioneer, and it hasn't happened.
How do we know, and this is the last question before we get back to finish the story, how do we know if we're in a pioneer moment or a moral licensing token moment? How do you know which thing has happened, whether it's Jackie Robinson or whether it's Sammy Davis Jr.?
Well, I suppose you just have to wait and see. I don't know whether it's a really interesting question. I don't have a good answer about what is it about moral licensing in the moment that distinguishes it from the kind of behavior where your willingness to let one person in lets them all in. I don't know. I think maybe it has something to do with the difficulty of the choice. With Jackie Robinson, maybe it was the fact that you couldn't deny how good all these players were, and teams started to make a lot more money when they had these players. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that was just, but that's a fascinating question.